figure it was still expected that you give birth to children who will be legally considered to be your first husband's children so that they can inherit his property. Why, you might ask, is such a thing a big deal? Well, you see, as a woman in that society, you needed sons who could assure and assume some responsibility for you and support you in your old age. It was extremely rare, if not impossible, for women to inherit any sort of material wealth. If you have no sons, you are helpless. So, even though this whole process seems strange to us, it made sense in those days. It served the community's best interest to make sure that the money, land, and wealth stayed in the family. Okay, so husband number one dies. You marry his brother as law dictates, but before you have any children, hubby number two dies. And in this morning's story, the situation is repeated with brothers number 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Now, if this were a real-life story today, we might just have another great murder mystery with a black widow on our hands. But this is just the hypothetical story that the know-it-all Sadducees used in an attempt to trick Jesus. By the way, in case you haven't figured it out yet, the answer about the penguins and the polar bears is none. That's because polar bears live in the North Pole and penguins inhabit the South Pole. Got it? That was an absurd question, wasn't it? It's one of those brain teasers that really don't mean a thing. And that's exactly what Jesus told the Sadducees. Their question about widows and brothers and their sons was, it was a brain teaser that didn't amount to a thing. Turning it all around as only Jesus can do, he said to them, listen here. You can talk about widows, brothers, penguins, and polar bears all you want to, but God won't fall for your trap. Don't get yourselves all caught up in the speculations about what resurrection is and is not. We too get our brains tied up in knots, trying to figure it all out, but no one's been able to do that as far as I know. And Jesus didn't tell us a whole lot about it. All Jesus says is that resurrection is a gift from God for all of us, and that we will all be living on in a new life. But it didn't leave us any sort of map or directions or detailed explanations. All Jesus said is that God is about living, and as far as God is concerned, all God's children are alive. Jesus went on to point out to the skeptical Sadducees that God did indeed speak to Moses about resurrection. Remember that burning bush? Jesus asked. Right then, at that moment, God spoke to Moses about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all long since dead, but God spoke of them as God's sons, still alive in the eyes of God. And that, my friends, is resurrection. You know, I'm always amazed by the people I meet on cruise ships. Several years ago, while I was sailing through the Caribbean, I met a couple from New Hampshire. They're great people, and we ended up having lots of marvelous and thoughtful conversations. Howard is an IT guy who works long hours and loves to sing in the church choir, but he insists that he's an atheist. Mary Beth is a school administrator who is about to retire in a few months. Anyway, during one of our conversations, I learned that Howard has contracted with a cryonics organization. In other words, Howard's body will be frozen following his death. The theory of cryonics is that someday, perhaps in 100 years or so, a cure will be found for whatever caused Howard's body to die. The cryonics organization will then thaw out Howard's body, and he will be alive once more. At least that's the theory. So I was amazed and fascinated by all this. His wife was skeptical, to say the least, but I wanted to know more. So I asked Howard about how he thinks he would be able to cope in a world that could be far different from the one he now knows. And I asked Howard, what happens if you're accidentally killed or some other disease causes your body to die again? And those questions stumped Howard. He just didn't know what to say. But he insisted that someday he would be brought back to life and live on in perhaps a different form. But he would be alive, nevertheless. Howard assured me that all of these questions would be answered after he was thawed out, so to speak. And yet, as I continued to reflect on all this cryonics discussion, it occurred to me that maybe what Howard was really searching for is some sort of assurance of his own resurrection. And who can blame Howard when it comes to the resurrection? We want to know what to expect. We want to be assured of what lies ahead for us. We want all the answers so we can be prepared. Fortunately, that isn't part of the promise from God. God doesn't give us all the answers, at least not in the way we expect. So, in the first place, let's forget all about the Sadducees' concerns about marriage and who will be our spouse in heaven. It could be that we will still be able to spend eternity with our loved ones, but we might just also have to spend eternity with some folks we didn't think would be there. It could be that we might learn a whole lot more about love in eternity than we ever knew in our earthly lives. It could be. You just never know. And that's the point. You just never know. No instance does Jesus clue us in on the answers we'd like to have about heaven. Theologian and author Barbara Brown Taylor reminds us that what Jesus did do was surrender life as we know it, and then those who loved him came to perfume his body, and they couldn't find him anywhere. When he showed up later, he showed up with the body. He ate fish, he broke bread, cooked breakfast. He also walked through locked doors and vanished while people were looking right at him. He was the same, but he was different. It could be that our futures may turn out to be just as amazing. Now, this is a story of water bugs and dragonflies. It's a story about transformation, resurrection, and ongoing life. Down below the surface of a quiet pond live a colony of water bugs. They are a happy colony, living far away from the sun. For many months, they were very busy, scurrying all over the soft mud on the bottom of the pond. They did notice that every once in a while, one of their colonies seemed to lose interest in going about with its friends. Clinging to the stem of a pond lily, it gradually moved out of sight and was seen no more. Look, said one of the water bugs to another, one of our colony is climbing up the lily stalk. Where do you suppose she's going? Up, 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 she went slowly, even as they watched the water bug disappear from sight. Her friends waited and waited, but she didn't come back. That's funny, said one water bug to another. Wasn't she happy here? Asked the second water bug. Where do you suppose she went? Wondered a third. No one had an answer. They were greatly puzzled. Finally, one of the water bugs, the leader of the colony, gathered his friends together. I have an idea. The next one of us who climbs up the lily stalk must promise to come back and tell us where he or she went and why. We promise, they all said. On spring day, not long after, the very water bug who had suggested the plan found himself climbing up the lily stalk. Up he went. Before he knew what was happening, he had broken through the surface of the water and fallen onto the broad green lily path above. Weary from his journey, he slept. When he woke up, he looked about with surprise. He couldn't believe what he saw. A startling change had come to his old body. His movement revealed 4 silver wings and a long tail. Even as he struggled, he felt an impulse to move his wings. The warmth of the sun soothed, dried the moisture from his new body. He moved his wings again and suddenly found himself up above the water. He had become a dragonfly. Swooping and dipping in great curves, he flew through the air. He felt exhilarated in his new atmosphere. By and by, the new dragonfly landed happily on the lily pad to rest. Then it was that he chanced to look below to the bottom of the pond. Why, he was right above his old friends, the water bugs. There they were, scurrying about just as he had been doing some time before. And the dragonfly remembered the promise. The next one of us who climbs up the lily stalk will come back and tell where he or she went and why. So without thinking, the dragonfly darted down. Suddenly, he hit the surface of the water and bounced away. Now that he was a dragonfly, he could no longer go into the water. I can't return, he said in dismay. I tried, but I can't keep my promise, even if I go back. Not one of the water bugs will know me in my new body. I'll just have to wait until they become dragonflies too. Then we'll all understand what happened to me and where I went. And the dragonfly winged off happily into its wonderful new world of sun and air. Resurrection is the promise of our continued union with God and God's faith in us. God's faithfulness is steadfast and secure. We may not know what the resurrection holds for us, but we do know that God will not abandon us. God's faith in us continues from life to death to life, and that's what we need to know. We don't come any closer to God by trying to answer hypothetical questions as the Sadducees did. Questions like, what if there was someone who was really bad in his or her whole life, then at the last minute repented and asked for forgiveness? Would he or she go to heaven? That kind of question results in dead words that attempt to put God in a box. That's the kind of question that looks for a loophole or an exception. Even though we continue to speculate, wonder, and worry, and talk about pearly gates, golden streets, and eternal harp music, that's all it is, speculation and wonder. Jesus continues to challenge us as he demands that we stretch our ideas about who and what God is and what God can and will do. Prophet Haggai had a lot of disgruntled and disappointed people on his hands back in October of 520 BC. The people had returned from exile in Babylon, and life was still a struggle. Many people who returned to Judah from exile had picturesque yet unrealistic views of life after Babylon. They expected everything to be just as it had been so many years before. But that's not what people found. Instead, life continued to be a struggle for survival. Drought had stunted their crops, and hunger was widespread. Inflation ate away at meager earnings. Jerusalem, for the most part, was still in ruins. People were more concerned about rebuilding their own lives and houses than rebuilding the temple to its previous grand and glorious state. Some folks lamented the feeble attempt to construct another temple that simply didn't measure up to their memories of glittering gold pillars and spectacular rooms that overwhelmed imaginations. Once again, people were convinced that God had abandoned them. So along came Haggai to remind everyone that a grand and glorious temple isn't the place to find God. Rather, God is with them in their everyday lives. God has been with the people in all times and in all places, and God continues to be with us in the ups and downs of our lives. Over the past few weeks, our Bible study group has been learning all about Job. At the beginning of the story, Job had it all: money, a great loving family, good health, and caring friends. But then, in almost an instant, Job's life was turned upside down. He lost everything, including his family and his health. He ended up sitting on a pile of garbage, scratching at his sores, and he was alone. Finally, some well-meaning friends showed up and tried to reason with him. You know, Job, they say, think back about your life. Somewhere, sometime along the line, you must have done something terrible to end up like this. Just admit it. Everything you're going through now is God's way of punishing you. Suddenly, Job stops his scratching and looks at his friends in the eye and says, "That's not it at all. I know that God is alive and caring for me, even though I have nothing left and I'm sitting on this pile of garbage. I know God exists and that someday God will be with me and I will live on." So here's what we need to understand. Job, Haggai, and Jesus are all trying to tell us that God is here and in heaven. Whatever it may be, life with God is forever. What we can do is learn to let God be God. Let God worry about heaven. Let us learn to focus on the living God here and now and live as faithfully as possible with God, who is walking with us from life to life. In other words, God is still speaking. May we be wise enough to listen and learn and know that God's love remains steadfast and forever, both here on earth and in heaven, whatever that may be.